Russian President Vladimir Putin launched the Ukraine war in February 2022. However, more than 16 months after the start of the war, Kremlin troops were unable to make any progress as the fighting was concentrated in eastern Ukraine. Russian President Vladimir Putin began to make preparations for this war a long time ago. In fact, the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014 is considered by some to be the beginning of the Ukrainian-Russian war. Although Putin has brought his army into the territory of Ukraine for the good of the Ukrainian people, it does not change the fact that the people suffer the most in this war. The two countries have been fighting for over a year now, but now the Russian military's war effort is largely exhausted. The strategic attacks of the Ukrainian army against the Russian army have a great impact on this. The most recent of these attacks took place last night when a Russian railway was hit in Crimea. Let's examine together how the war effort of the Russian army was exhausted and the strategic attacks of the Ukrainian army. Bryansk, one of the easternmost regions of Russia, was heavily affected by the conflicts on the Eastern Front. The most obvious of these effects has occurred in the past few days. The other day, the Eastern Command of the Ukrainian Armed Forces announced that it blew up a freight train near the Ukrainian border with successful HIMARS shots. The supply train carrying ballistic missiles to the Russian army moving along the Bryansk railway in the eastern Donetsk district was successfully destroyed by Ukrainian mechanized troops. According to the first determinations, no one was killed or injured in the explosion except for 20 Russian soldiers on the train. This explosion took place during the Battle of Bakhmut when the Ukrainian army blockaded Russian troops. The eastern group of the Ukrainian army announced that the explosions occurred on the 136 kilometer between Bryansk and Unikwa, and that the Ukrainian mechanized troops destroyed the Russian train carrying ballistic missiles with successful HIMARS shots. While Russia did not make any statement after the explosion, the eastern group of Ukraine shared the footage taken with a drone camera of the moments when the train was destroyed on social media. The images were watched 50,000 times in the first hour of sharing. In a statement, the Russian Railways Company stated that the Ukrainian army was responsible for the explosion, adding that the explosion caused destruction along the railway and caused the suspension of train services. Bryansk shares a border with Ukraine to the south and Belarus to the west. The destruction of the Russian train came after the previous attack just days ago. Ukraine bombed the village of Zamka in Bryansk over the weekend, killing 4 civilians, according to Belarusian officials. Authorities blamed the Ukrainian army for the bombardment, which also completely destroyed a residential building. In a statement made by the Ukrainian General Staff, he stated that the Ukrainian army did not attack civilian settlements. They did not know who the attackers were and did not accept these attacks. Last March, Russia claimed it was fighting an attack, accusing Ukrainian troops of crossing the border into Bryansk, shooting at citizens and taking 6 people hostage. But Ukraine said it played no role in this attack. The blow-up of the train carrying ballistic missiles inflicted great damage on the Russian army before they expected counterattack by Ukraine. The Ukrainian counter-offensive last autumn dealt a major blow to Putin's war effort, retaking thousands of miles of Russian-controlled territory. Now, with the harsh winter replaced by a warm spring, military analysts believe Ukraine will potentially try to drive Russian troops out of its territory, including in Crimea, which Russia annexed in 2014. So what kind of operations is Ukraine conducting for the expected counterattack? After intelligence arrived that the Ukrainian army was preparing for a major counterattack, the military began to conduct offensive operations, largely aimed at Russian supply lines and defense efforts. These attacks generally took place as HIMARS howitzer UAV and missile attacks. In the past weeks, gunshots and explosions were heard in the town of Zhytomyr in northern Crimea. Judging by the videos posted on social media, Jankoy was attacked by a kamikaze drone. According to the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, an incident occurred as a result of the explosion of Caliber missiles transported by rail in the northern region of Crimea. The leader of the Russian-appointed Jankoy city confirmed that Zonkiao railway was attacked by drones. Ukraine acknowledged the explosions but did not take responsibility indirectly. Although Ukraine did not take full responsibility for the attacks, it was recorded as one of the harshest attacks on Russia's supply lines. The blasts continue the process of Russian disarmament and prepared to free Ukraine's Crimean peninsula from Russian control. The electricity grid was damaged in the attack and a railroad worker was also injured. Ukraine reported that the destroyed Russian-caliber cruise missiles had an operational range exceeding 2,500 kilometers on land and 375 kilometers at sea. Russia last accused Ukraine of attacking the Black Sea Fleet with a drone in the Crimean port of Sevastopol in October 2022. It was stated that 9 unmanned aerial vehicles were used in the attack that damaged a warship. Ukraine did not claim responsibility for the attack. For some geographical reason, Russian rail traffic is heading north towards Kherson Oblast before heading south to the port of Sevastopol. The presence of calibers in the railway yard in Junkai is perfectly understandable since Junkai is the hub connecting the Russian railway to Kherson and Sevastopol. Assuming Kherson was under Ukrainian control, the caliber missiles would probably be deployed to Sevastopol and from there to the Black Sea Fleet. Although Ukraine did not fully claim responsibility for the attack, this attack undoubtedly undermined Russia's effort in a big way. Some experts consider this attack to be a retaliation of the Ukrainian military to Russian President Vladimir Putin's visit to Crimea and Mariupol. As a matter of fact, these thoughts are not empty thoughts. So what happened in Mariupol? Mariupol has been under Russian control for more than 10 months after being devastated in one of the longest and fiercest battles of the conflict. Ukraine says that more than 20,000 civilians have been killed there. An analysis estimates that 90% of the buildings were damaged and about 350,000 of the pre-war population of about 500,000 were forced to leave the area. A group of Melitopol residents said that Russia is conducting an expensive campaign to rebuild the city and win the hearts and minds of people. The aim is to assimilate Mariupol and make it the owner of Russia. Russian officials say 300,000 people currently still live there. The conflict saw Russia hit the Mariupol theater, where hundreds of civilians took refuge. The building collapsed and at least 300 people are believed to have died there. Ukraine and human rights groups say the attack constitutes a war crime. The United Nations said the Battle of Mariupol was among the events for which Putin and his regime could be held legally responsible. Thereupon, the International Criminal Court said it had issued an order for Putin's arrest in connection with the illegal deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia. This means that if he sets foot in any of the court's 123 member states, he can be arrested. Kiev authorities have pledged to liberate all areas under Russian control, including Crimea, which was annexed by Russia in 2014. At the point we have arrived at, we clearly see that the Kiev authorities stand behind their promises and strive to liberate the Russian-controlled regions one by one. It is difficult to know what awaits us in the coming days, but we sincerely believe that Ukraine's freedom efforts will come to an end. The start of Ukraine's long-awaited counter-offensive is now very close. Tension remains on Ukraine's southern front line ahead of the decisive counterattack. Protests and attacks broke out throughout the week in the Russian-controlled cities of Kherson, Melitopol, and Bryansk. These cities in the south formed part of Russia's mainland route to Crimea. Ukraine frequently attacks this route to cut off the land route between Crimea and Russia. It is also exposed to airstrikes in Bryansk, Belgorod, Rostov, and Krasnodar, the border cities of the Russian Federation in the west and south. Russia's hands are tied in the face of these attacks. The main target of these attacks is the liberation of all occupied Ukrainian lands, especially Crimea. Especially in recent days, attacks on critical supply lines have put Moscow on red alert. At least 6 explosions were heard near the Russian-occupied Melitopol in the Zaporizhia Oblast the other day. Melitopol serves as an important railway hub for Russian forces in southern Ukraine and plays an important role in connecting occupied Crimea. According to the exiled mayor of the city, Ivan Fedorov, 5 explosions were heard in Melitopol. The explosions caused heavy smoke north of Melitopol. At least 1 explosion was also reported on a railway in the Dolinska district near Melitopol. Russian forces were using this railway to transport military equipment and personnel from Krasnodar via the Kerch Bridge from the Crimea line to Donbass and Mariupol. Melitopol, a city with a population of about 150,000, has been under Russian occupation since late February 2022. Another important logistics and supplies center providing supplies to the Russian troops is at the focal point of the attacks in Bryansk. A long-range attack hit the Russian-held port city in the Sea of Azov. The attack on Bryansk is another example of Ukraine's ability to hit Russian targets far beyond the front lines. Bryansk, about 96 kilometers from the front lines, is the latest example of long-range targets that Ukraine can now hit thanks to donated weapons. This is at least the 4th attack on the port city in recent weeks. Following this latest attack, a Russian deployed official said that the attack was carried out by Storm Shadow air-launched cruise missiles supplied by the United Kingdom. Ukraine's Bryansk City Military Administration Telegram channel stated that as a result of the attack, a large number of Russian ships docked at the port fled from the Ukrainian coast, capturing Bryansk. In the early days of this all-out conflict was a big win for the Russians. In addition to confiscating about a dozen ships from the Ukrainian Navy at the time, it is an important logistics and supplies center providing supplies to Russian troops in the region. The main purpose of the Ukrainian armed force is attacking the railways and ports is to cut off the connection between Crimea and southern Ukraine by disrupting Russia's supply lines. It's unclear where the weight of Ukraine's impending counter-offensive will fall, but a successful attack on the southern Kherson and Zaporizhia regions could open the way to the Crimea and cut off the Russian supply route to the peninsula. That's why the key piece of land here is Crimea, as it is known. The leader of Kiev has often expressed his insistence on taking back Crimea. Zelensky's insistence gained meaning with the plans made. Let's take a closer look at Ukraine's plan for Crimea. Ukraine has outlined a plan for how it can reclaim control of Crimea from Putin's hands. Alexei Danilov, Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, published the plan ahead of the counterattack that Kiev is planning this spring. The plan includes dismantling the massive 19-kilometer bridge between Crimea and Russia, which has been dubbed Europe's longest bridge. Located between the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, Crimea is home to tens of thousands of deployed Russian soldiers and numerous Russian military bases. White House officials insist that there has been no change in position. He states that Crimea belongs to Ukraine. In fact, the United States is one step closer to Putin's red line by saying the way to neutralize Crimea. What could be the US formula to force Putin? Let's consider in detail. The United States argues that Ukraine can seize Crimea without violence. Us diplomats and many senior officials are suggesting the blockade option to curb Russian aggression. According to a former US diplomat, both countries are likely on the verge of launching new attacks. According to the diplomat, a blockade of Crimea from Russian aggression is a better option than the Ukrainian attempt to seize the region. The US diplomat is not alone in his views. Voices for Ukraine's blockade of Crimea are increasing. Retired US Army Europe Commander Ben Hodges has urged Kiev forces to isolate Crimea using long-range precision strikes. Hodges said drive the Black Sea Fleet with daily precision strikes from Sevastopol. Do the same for the Russian Air Force at Saki. Ukraine can use low-cost explosive uncrewed surface ships for swarm attacks against Russian warships stationed in Sevastopol. The concept is simple. Loaded with cameras loaded with explosives, low-profile USBs are aimed at targets. This emerging technology could sink warships and destroy naval infrastructure. The blockade approach could be part of a successful strategy to return Crimea to Ukraine. However, this depends on the degree of military support Ukraine receives from the international community. There are multiple other variants at play. Much will also depend on the outcome of battles elsewhere in Ukraine. A series of major failures by the Russian military could quickly change expectations and cause successive retreats. We have already seen the migration of the inhabitants of Crimea after the successful attacks. At this point, it's important to emphasize that Crimea is part of Ukraine and that multiple options for evasion are reasonable and actionable. Many seemingly unlikely scenarios can quickly become possible. On the other hand, it is unclear where the weight of Ukraine's upcoming counter-offensive will fall. But a successful attack on the southern Kherson and Zaporizhia regions could open the way to the Crimea and cut off the Russian supply route to the peninsula. Ukraine and its foreign partners hope that the next move will lay the foundation for the eventual liberation of Crimea, which has been at the center of the Ukraine-Russia conflict for more than 9 years. Foreign partners urged Kiev to be careful about Crimea. Recent leaks of the alleged Pentagon intelligence seem to show us skepticism about how far the Ukrainians can take their next offensive. US Joint Chief of Staff General Mark Milley stated that Kiev is facing a very difficult operation in Crimea. Russia's nuclear weapons also stand on the Crimean issue. Russian President Vladimir Putin and his top officials have repeatedly pointed to a nuclear escalation in Ukraine, with Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev saying in February that any weapon would be considered for the region's defense, assuming Ukrainian troops are successful in southern Ukraine. Approaching Crimea still poses great geographical challenges. Crimea is separated from the mainland by the Perekop Isthmus, which is just over 4 miles long at its widest point. There are only 2 roads leading south to the Crimea, with both now surrounded by new Russian fortifications. The eastern road could be made impassable by demolishing a bridge. The swampy terrain in the neck of the peninsula can cause problems for heavy armor and other vehicles. It could potentially slow Ukraine's advance and divert attacking troops into prepared fire corridors. Nevertheless, despite the geographical difficulty of the historical peninsula, Ukraine is determined to take back Crimea. In October, a truck bomb significantly damaged the bridge and Russia flagged Ukrainian military intelligence. Ukraine did not claim responsibility for the bomb, but Ukrainian authorities have repeatedly threatened to hit the bridge in the past. Also in the Danilov plan, he proposed that all Ukrainians working for the Moscow-appointed administration in Crimea be prosecuted. Danilov said that some of the employees will face criminal charges, while others will lose their state pensions and be barred from public jobs. According to the plan, Russians who moved to the Crimea after 2014 will be deported. Meanwhile, all real estate deals made under Russian rule would be voided. It is difficult to predict when Kiev will realize the Crimean plan. However, looking at the successes achieved on the front lines, Crimea is not an impossible target for Ukraine. Crimea is Ukraine, and one day this historical peninsula will return to its real owner. In the coming days, we will wait and see whether the successes of the Ukrainian armed forces in the counter-offensive will bring Kiev closer to Crimea. There is a lot of good news from the original direction when it comes to the western flank. The Ukrainian 130th Brigade finally released the video of how they stormed and successfully captured Lipkovo. The video shows how the main attack group advances along the tree lines and prepares to enter the settlement. Ukrainians use small mortar systems to be able to react very quickly to the organized enemy defenses and suppress their fire. After around 5 minutes of work, Ukrainians were ready to enter the outer edge of the settlement. Today, Russian sources reported that Ukrainians were already digging trenches and preparing fortifications in the southern part of the settlement right near Piatykhati. Russians once again claimed that they unleashed their artillery and the Ukrainians abandoned the village without a fight. However, some sources specify that only one personnel carrier arrived at the village, collected the wounded, brought reinforcements, and left. The freshest reports indicate that Russians engaged several Ukrainian assault units in the vicinity of the Arabian Sea. However, the specifics are yet unknown when it comes to the main direction of attack. First of all, today, Ukrainian sources reported that battalion and brigade commanders had a meeting with the higher-level commanders specifically to communicate the solutions to the problems that they encountered in the first days. And it was confirmed that all plans were adjusted. One of the lower-level commanders said that mistakes were inevitable at the beginning because it was simply impossible to predict everything on paper. He said that one of the things that they implemented is a new approach to engineering. Reconnaissance and Russian mines have already become a lesser problem. Ukrainian forces also received a lot of critique for not using mine rollers. However, it turned out that the initial Russian footage just did not include Russian mine rollers to show the enemy in a bad light. Recent footage confirms that Ukrainians did not attack unprepared. Today, Ukrainians also confirmed that they successfully evacuated Leopard tanks and most of them had minor damage. So Ukrainians quickly changed the road wheels to the tracks and the tanks were ready for use, and Ukrainians managed to evacuate those tanks from the front line because in the aftermath of yesterday's battle, the front line shifted by up to 3 kilometers. Over the last 3 days, Russian sources were continuously reporting that even though Ukrainians managed to take several positions, their attacks were repelled and later all lost positions were recaptured. However, if we look at these Russian maps, we can see that over the last 3 days, the front line shifted south significantly. In fact, Ukrainians managed to penetrate a 16-kilometer wide front by up to 3 kilometers. And this is consistent with the reports that Ukrainians managed to get very close to Robotnik and also captured tactical heights, because if you look at the topographic map, we can see that Ukrainians captured precisely the hill that we discussed yesterday, even according to Russian maps. This is also consistent with the reports of Ukrainian fighters who claimed that they now have direct visual control of the main Russian strongholds. Recently, a Russian commander elaborated on the Russian tactics. The goal of the first line of defense is to exhaust Ukrainian attackers, and if the attack is too intense, retreat to the second line. Once the Ukrainian attackers exhaust their offensive capabilities, Russians deployed their reserves, counterattack the exhausted Ukrainians and recapture all positions. It seems like so far the second part of the plan did not really work. One of the reasons why it doesn't work is that after the attack, Ukrainians use remote anti-armor mine systems or to distantly mine the roads that are used by Russian reserves. REM is a specialist artillery shell that scatters anti-armor mines up to 17 kilometers away from the firing unit. Today, Russian sources reported that Ukrainians managed to mine all the main Russian roads between Robotnik and Verbov, which is exactly where Ukrainians are trained to advance. Several hours ago, Russian sources reported that Ukrainians launched artillery preparation, which is why they're preparing to face yet another wave of attack at night. Russian sources complain that Ukrainians switched to night attacks because Western equipment gives them the edge on the battlefield at night. The head of one of the Russian organizations for the inspection and supplies of weapons, Rogozin, stated that he does not share the enthusiasm around the reports of the Ukrainian defeat. He said that Ukrainians have accumulated 600 tanks in the Orikhiv direction and that we are yet to see the main phase of the counter-offensive operation.